My father was a pillar of our community, a man everyone admired. To me, he was a monster who demanded my life savings to fund his secret. And when I refused, he destroyed my reputation and turned my entire family against me. For years, I lived as the villain in his story. But a deathbed request led me to uncover a horrifying truth. A web of financial crime far darker than I ever imagined. They all thought his funeral would be the final chapter of his legacy. They had no idea it was the beginning of my revenge story. You will not believe how this ends. Listen to the whole story to hear how I used one final speech to bring his entire empire of lies crashing down. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. The air in the chapel was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and collective grief. From my seat in the front pew, I could see the polished mahogany of the casket, gleaming under the soft, forgiving light of the stained glass windows. One by one, people stepped up to the podium to eulogize my father, Richard Sterling. They painted him in broad, reverent strokes, a titan of Austin real estate, a philanthropist, a devoted husband, a patriarch. My uncle called him the oak tree our family was built around. Mrs. Gable from down the street wept as she recounted how he'd personally co-signed a loan for her son's first business. Each word was a tiny, sharp stone pelting my conscience. They were mourning a saint. I was burying a monster, and in a way, I was the one who had put him in the ground. It all started 3 years ago, on a deceptively beautiful Sunday afternoon. The kind of Texas day where the sky is a vast, cloudless blue, and the heat radiating off the pavement feels like a promise of good things to come. I was 35, a senior financial analyst at a reputable firm in downtown Austin, and I just finished putting the final touches on a financial plan that would see me and my fiancée, Sarah, comfortable for the rest of our lives. We had a nest egg of just over $250,000, every cent earned through disciplined saving, shrewd investments, and countless late nights. It was our future, our security. That afternoon, my parents summoned me to their sprawling home in Westlake Hills. The house itself was a testament to my father's persona, imposing, classical, with white columns that projected an image of old money stability we didn't actually possess. My mother, Carol, greeted me at the door, her smile tight, her eyes already pleading. That was her tell. It was the please don't make waves look I'd known since childhood. My father was in his study, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of leather and self-importance. He didn't get up. He just gestured to the chair opposite his massive desk, a throne from which he'd issued decrees my entire life. "Alex," he began, his voice a low, confident rumble. "I've got an opportunity, the kind that only comes along once in a generation." He slid a glossy brochure across the desk, Sterling Meadows. It featured architectural renderings of a luxury retirement community, complete with a golf course and a state-of-the-art wellness center. It was ambitious, too ambitious, too ambitious. "This is my legacy," he said, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, dangerous fire. "But to get the final round of institutional funding, I need to show more liquidity. I need to shore up the family's position." He leaned forward, his gaze pinning me to the chair. "I need you to invest your savings. All of it, $250,000. It wasn't a request. It was a demand dressed up as an honor." I felt the air leave my lungs. I, the financial analyst, was being asked to dump my entire life's savings into a project without so much as a glance at a balance sheet. "Dad, that's everything Sarah and I have," I stammered. "Can I at least see the full prospectus? The financial statements, the debt structure?" His face hardened. The charismatic community leader vanished, replaced by the cold, cruel man I knew all too well. "Prospectus? You're my son, not a goddamn hedge fund. This is about family. It's about loyalty. It's about you finally showing me that you believe in me." That was his favorite weapon, framing everything as the test of love. For years it had worked. I'd let him borrow money I never saw again. I'd co-signed a car loan in college that he defaulted on, tanking my credit for years. My whole life had been a series of small capitulations to keep the peace. But this was different. This wasn't a few $1,000s. This was my future. I took a deep breath. "Dad, from a professional standpoint, I can't do it. It's too risky. It's an undiversified, highly speculative investment. It would be irresponsible." The silence that followed was terrifying. He just stared at me, his jaw working. Then, he let out a short, bitter laugh. Irresponsible. You, my own son, are calling me irresponsible. He stood up, his large frame casting a shadow over the desk. I see. After everything I've given you, the schools, the opportunities, this is the thanks I get. You'd rather watch me fail than lift a finger to help. The gaslighting had begun. He was twisting my prudence into an act of malice. That's not what I'm saying, I pleaded. I'm just trying to be careful. You're being selfish, he roared, slamming his hand on the desk. The pens in the holder jumped. You're a cold, ungrateful boy, Alex. You always have been. Get out of my house. And don't you dare come back until you've decided which family you belong to, yours, or the one you're building with that girl. I walked out in a daze. My mother was waiting in the hallway, her hands clasped together, her face a mask of anxiety. Just do it, Alex, she whispered, her voice trembling. Please, it's just money. You know how he gets. It's not worth the fighting. Just give it to him. Mom, it's not just money. It's my life, I said, my own voice shaking with a rage I rarely allowed myself to feel. And when has keeping the peace ever actually brought us peace? It just delays the next explosion. I left without another word. That was the day the chasm between us became a canyon. Sarah supported my decision without hesitation, but the fallout was immediate and brutal. My parents uninvited us from Thanksgiving. My calls to my mother went to voicemail. At a cousin's birthday party, my aunt pulled me aside and told me she was deeply disappointed in my lack of family loyalty. The smear campaign had started. My father was a master of narrative. To the outside world, he was the visionary patriarch, and I was the icy modern son who had turned his back on him. He told everyone I was jealous of his success, that I had a bean counter mentality with no room for faith or vision. 6 months later, the news broke. Sterling Meadows had collapsed. The institutional funding never materialized, contractors filed liens for non-payment, and the whole project was a black hole of debt. I felt a grim, hollow sense of vindication. I had been right. But my father was a genius of self-preservation. He couldn't accept failure, so he simply manufactured a new reality. A week after the news hit, an article appeared in the local business journal. It was an interview with my father, where he lamented the project's failure, and then he dropped the bombshell. It was a tragedy of timing, he was quoted as saying, his voice no doubt dripping with false sincerity. We were so close, but a key private investor, a family member, I'm sad to say, pulled out at the last minute. It created a crisis of confidence. The big banks got spooked. One person's lack of faith brought the whole dream crashing down. He didn't use my name, he didn't have to. Everyone knew. My phone blew up. Not with messages of support but with outrage directed at me. How could you? A text from my cousin read, "You ruined him." I was stunned. I felt like I was losing my mind. He hadn't just lied, he had inverted reality. He had taken my sound, responsible decision, the very act that saved my family from financial ruin, and weaponized it, painting me as the saboteur of his dreams. My refusal to participate in his failure was now the cause of his failure. It was the most profound, most disorienting act of gaslighting I had ever experienced. I was no longer just the ungrateful son. I was the villain who had single-handedly destroyed the Sterling family legacy. And the worst part? Everyone, including my own mother, believed him. They needed to believe him, because the alternative, that their oak tree was rotten to the core, was simply too terrifying to contemplate. I was completely and utterly alone. The 2 years that followed were a cold war of silence. I built a wall around my life. Sarah and I got married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with her family and 2 of our friends as witnesses. I didn't even tell my parents. I saw pictures on social media of family gatherings I wasn't invited to. My absence a gaping hole no one seemed to notice. The pain of that exile was a constant, low-grade fever. It was a strange kind of grief, mourning people who were still alive. I poured myself into my work and into my marriage, finding solace in the quiet, predictable stability that Sarah and I built together, a world away from the emotional chaos of my upbringing. Then, about a year ago, I got a call from my aunt. My father had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim. A part of me, the part that had been conditioned since birth to feel responsible for his happiness, felt a pang of guilt. The larger part of me, the part that remembered the study and the venom in his voice, felt a cold, hard nothing. His decline was rapid. My mother would call me periodically. her voice brittle with exhaustion, detailing the mounting medical bills and the stress. The Sterling family finances, I gathered, were in ruins. The failure of Sterling Meadows had been the first domino in a long, catastrophic chain. They had sold the big house in Westlake Hills and moved into a modest condo. My father, the titan of industry, was broke. A week before he died, my mother called me, hysterical. "Alex, you have to come. He's asking for you. He says it's important." Against my better judgment, I went. The condo was sterile and smelled of antiseptic. My father was shrunken, a pale imitation of the giant who had haunted my life. He was propped up in a hospital bed in the living room, an IV stand his only companion. "Alex," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. He tried to offer a weak, conciliatory smile. It looked like a grimace. I messed up. I know that." My heart, stupidly, leaped. Was this it? The apology? The moment of reconciliation I'd secretly, shamefully longed for? "There's a way to make it right," he continued, his eyes gaining a flicker of their old manipulative intensity. "For your mother, I have a life insurance policy, a big one, $2 million. But with everything going on, we're behind on the premiums. 3 months behind. If we don't pay it in the next 48 hours, it lapses." He reached out a trembling, skeletal hand. "The payment is $12,000, son. I need you to pay it, please. It's the only thing I have left to give your mother. You'll be the beneficiary, of course. You can pay yourself back and make everything right. One last chance to fix this family." I looked at my mother, who was nodding eagerly, her face full of desperate hope. It was the same trap, just with higher stakes. Another test of my love, another demand for my money, framed as my salvation. The learned helplessness was a powerful tide, pulling me under. My first instinct was to say yes, to write the check, to make the pain stop. But 2 years of distance had given me something I'd never had before, clarity. "I'll look into it, Dad," I said, my voice even and calm. I left the condo, my father's weak protests and my mother's sobs following me down the hall. That night, I didn't sleep. I launched my own financial crime investigation. I was no longer his son, I was an analyst, and he was a high-risk asset I needed to vet. I used my firm's access to professional databases. I pulled property records, UCC filings, and old corporate documents. I made quiet calls to former colleagues of my father, people he'd burned over the years who now had no reason to protect him. What I found was staggering. Sterling Meadows wasn't just a bad investment, it was an outright fraud. A classic Ponzi scheme. He'd been using money from new investors to pay off old ones for years, creating the illusion of a thriving business empire. The whole thing was a house of cards, and he was deep into embezzling from his own partners. The $250,000 he demanded from me wasn't seed money. It was a desperate last-ditch infusion he needed to pay off a major investor who was threatening to expose him. My refusal hadn't just been a personal slight. It had been the final pin that popped his criminal balloon. He hadn't wanted a partner, he'd wanted an accomplice. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The man who had lectured me my whole life about honor and integrity was a common thief. Then I investigated the life insurance policy. It was real, just as he'd said. But what he failed to mention was the series of massive loans he had taken out against its cash value over the years. I got a copy of the in-force ledger. The total death benefit was $2 million. The outstanding loan balance against it was $1,980,000. After paying the $12,000 in back premiums, the net payout would be a paltry $8,000. He was trying to trick me into spending $12,000 of my own money to get $8,000 back. All so he could die believing he'd conned his ungrateful son one last time. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it finally severed the last thread of familial obligation. He didn't want to fix anything, he just wanted to win. My father died 2 days later, and that brings me back to the funeral. When my uncle finished his tearful eulogy, a hush fell over the chapel. All eyes turned to me, the prodigal son. My mother gave me a look that was a complex cocktail of grief, hope, and command. Say the right thing. Preserve his memory. Keep the peace. I walked to the podium, my heart hammering not with fear, but with a strange, icy calm. I looked out at the faces, my family, my father's friends, the people he'd duped. "My name is Alex Sterling," I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. "My father, Richard, taught me everything I know about finance. He taught me the importance of due diligence, of scrutinizing every number, and of always seeking the truth. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I saw my mother nod, a small relieved smile on her lips, and in his final days I continued. I honored him by applying those lessons. I conducted a final review of his legacy. I pulled a neatly folded sheaf of papers from my jacket pocket. Many of you knew him as a great businessman. But the numbers tell a different story. Sterling Meadows, the dream he sold to so many, was not a failed venture. It was a Ponzi scheme, and I have the bank transfers and sworn affidavits to prove it. A collective gasp rippled through the chapel. My mother's face went white. My uncle started to rise from his seat, but I held up a hand. "Mrs. Gable," I said, my eyes finding her in the third row. "The loan he co-signed for your son wasn't an act of charity. It was a way to launder money from an account he was hiding from his business partners. I've sent the details to your son's accountant." I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the detached precision of an auditor delivering a report. I laid it all out: the fraud, the embezzlement, the lies, the shell corporations. I explained the life insurance scheme, detailing exactly how he had tried to swindle me out of $12,000 on his deathbed. "My father's real legacy isn't one of community leadership," I said, my voice finally cracking with the weight of it all. "It's a legacy of debt, deceit, and profound betrayal. He didn't fail because I lacked faith. He failed because his entire life was a lie. I refused to give him my money not because I didn't love him, but because I did my job. I saw the truth." I folded my papers and placed them back in my pocket. "Many of you in this room are victims. My only hope is that this truth, as ugly as it is, will finally set you and my family free from the fiction he so carefully constructed." I looked directly at my mother. Her face was a ruin of disbelief and horror. For the first time, she was forced to see the man she'd spent 50 years enabling, without the filter of her own denial. I walked down from the podium, past the shocked, silent faces, past the casket, and out the heavy chapel doors into the bright Texas sun. I didn't look back. The war was over. I hadn't won with anger or revenge in the traditional sense. I had won with the one thing my father could never manipulate: the cold, hard, unassailable truth. For the first time in my life, I felt the heavy weight of his world lift from my shoulders. I was no longer a character in his story. I was the author of my own, and I was finally, completely free.